And so I wrote this ebook to encourage survivors to say, you're not crazy when you turn on the news and your heart rate starts to rise up. You're not crazy if your dream life has started to be invaded with the fears of what could be. You're not crazy if you're having, a lot of strained relationships with family and friends, not necessarily on who did you vote for, or who you align yourself with, but um, where things could potentially be heading. Um, it is going to be very hard for religious trauma survivors. So my first form of resource was this ebook to get it into the hands of people that say, I don't know who to talk about this. I don't know how to articulate this to my husband, to my coworkers, what I feel because of what I've experienced. You will find things in there that help explain where you are right now and some tips on how to move forward as, politically things start to change here in this nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Truth That Heals podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anthony Hernandez, and today I'm with special guest, Nikki G, also known as Nikki G Speaks. Welcome to the Truth That Heals, Nikki. How are you doing?
Thanks for inviting me, Ryan. We've been trying to do this for like maybe a whole year, and we finally got to it right now. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much.
And I'm excited to have you on the show. I see that you are an educator, a speaker, and you focus on recovery from cult trauma. So we're going to be getting into that in this interview. But I always like to start by getting to know the guest better. And I think that the audience would always love to get to know the person in a more personal level, not too personal, but get to know who you are and what your story is. Because it's not just out of the blue that someone just decides, okay, I'm going to be an educator or a coach on cults. So can you help us see, where did this all begin for you? Where now today your focus is on educating people on cult trauma. Where did it all begin?
Well, if we have 5 days, we can go through it all. But because we don't, I'll start you off with, I come from a religious, narcissistic family system. And so it was in my family of origin, a lot of things I was programmed with, indoctrinated with. Obviously, I was not aware when I was a child, going into my adolescence years, and even as a young adult. I just knew there was a lot of tension, dysfunction, and I just couldn't put my finger on a lot of it. But when I was there, I can look back now and see how I was encouraged and programmed, if you will, to not really connect with my intuition. I was used to seeing my parents as, they are your parents and they kind of rear you or should rear you in the ways that you should go. But a lot of times the things that I perceived and the things that I was aware of with the family dynamics, much of that they were not willing to deal with or to even, touch or admit and acknowledge. And so a lot of what I discerned intuitively was often, dismissed, ignored, or I was labeled to be too sensitive, or I'm always, thinking something's wrong. And that wasn't the case. I could just see it. Well, over the years, if you continually have that happen to you, you start to disconnect from your authentic self. You start to disconnect from your intuition. And I was also indirectly started to be programmed with the notion that authority figures always know what's right, and their version of reality, even if it's distorted, is what reality is. So if an authority leader says the sky is brown, but I can see that it's blue, I learned to dismiss what reality was for me and, believe whatever the authority figure said. Now, I mean, you're in a family dynamic, that doesn't seem too bad, but as the years went on, this followed and I carried this throughout my years of interpersonal relationships. And then I carried this into my church history and my involvement with, multiple cults. So again, choices I made were my choices, but we usually choose things that feel familiar to us. We usually choose things either that feels familiar or that we did not receive in childhood. So we reach for that. So throughout my journey, as I got older, I found myself in multiple toxic relationships. I found myself, and because it was a religious narcissistic family system, I got saved when I was 19 years old. And let me tell you about that. It's kind of ironic how I got saved. I didn't walk down the aisle and give my life to Jesus like that. I started reading conspiracy theory books. I went to college for away for a year, and I got with people who really love to learn, and they told me about a couple of books and I bought them. And so I just started doing the deep dive and going down the rabbit's hole. But everything I was studying about, like the governmental plots and Illuminati and all this other stuff, I found things were referring to the Bible a lot. The book of Revelation, the book of Ezekiel and Daniel about, the end times and about the rapture. And I'm like, wait a minute, this seems very parallel with this New World Order stuff. So are you meaning to tell me the way to be safe throughout all of that is to have a relationship with Jesus? Okay, I'm sold. I was raised around it anyway. Maybe I'll make it real for me. So at 19, I got saved in my basement. No one was there. It was like, okay, Jesus, and it was very selfish, but I was like, if you're going to save me and make sure I'm good when all this stuff goes down, all right, I will accept you into my life. I don't think you're a bad person. I've been raised around this all my life, but now I'm going to make it personal. So I thought that was going to be my heart posture with that. But then it became real. I
Mhm.
started reading more and reading more. And so what used to be just my parents' religion now became my religion, and it was personal. And I really started taking it seriously. And my parents were shocked because prior to that, I was, one of the, not the good daughter. I was kind of out there, playing around. And my 19, 18, 16-year old, my brother says I was out there just doing God knows what. So to me, this was like turning a new page. I'm, going to live right. And I started at the church that I grew up in. I started leading Bible study for the youth. So it went from maybe 5 to 10 that would come to like 20 to 50. It just started growing. So now I'm not only making this real, but now I'm getting inspired, and now I want to share it with people. And so I started sharing with everybody, and it became contagious for me, and so I wanted more. The church I was raised in, it was Baptist, and it was just kind of like you could fall asleep on the pews because it was so boring. But then I said, you know what? I want more. And I stumbled upon this church where there was a lot of young adults, and they were on fire for God. They were trying to live this life. They were reading their Bible when no one had to tell them. They were worshiping when no one was looking. And I'm like, those are my people, the ones that are really trying to do this. And so I joined the church, and it was predominantly Black. And that became my entry point into what would eventually be my first cult. And so I did not know that that's what it was. I just saw a lot of young people, didn't see that as a red flag. And I saw that the leadership was very zealous and they very extravagant. And I liked all of that. And eventually I would find out it was a cult after I left or realized that. And that is the first cult I was in. The cult leader was a woman, and that is my now 23-year-old daughter. That is her grandmother. So I had I had a child with the cult leader's son. And that story in and of itself is like a 5-day movie. But when I left there, I was just, totally bummed and just like I thought God wouldn't love me anymore. And then I started working through those feelings. But then I started realizing something's not right with that church. And that is when I started but I spiritualized my experience. I
Mhm.
was finding scriptures to justify how the cult leader treated me was wrong and how she led, the church was wrong. And so I found scriptures in Ezekiel and stuff about the Jezebel spirit and the religious spirit. So I spiritualized it. And I eventually was like, well, I'm going to still go back to church. I need to be in the house of God. And I went to a church what I would call semi-normal, a couple of them semi-normal after that. Um, but there was this there was this thirst in me where my church type, and this is some an exercise I do with some of my clients. What's your church type? My church type was, I didn't like the churches that were like just very melancholy and there was no life in it and it was boring. I like the intense. I like the churches that had the flags and they had the shofars and they were just all out for God. And I found that when I went to a church that didn't do that, they were relatively okay. They weren't abusive. You
Mhm.
know, there wasn't religious abuse or cult abuse there. But the ones that I tended to gravitate to, those were the ones that ended up being very abusive and ended up being cults. So I eventually got drawn into my next cult, which is it's an organization. It's been in the news over the past year called the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. I started watching them online. I saw how they had a 24/7 house of prayer and they never stopped. And it was, again, filled with young adults. I didn't see that that could have been a big marker. And I'm not saying that any church or spiritual community that is majority young adults that it means it's a cult, but it's something to start paying attention to if that's majority of the attendees. And they were talking about the end times. And remember, that's how I got saved. So that pulled me in. The young adults on fire for God, that pulls me in. And they were teaching about the love of Christ as well as teaching about the end times. And so I went to go visit there and I was like, I am sold. I am moving because I'm originally from Jersey, y'all. I am moving from Jersey to the middle of the country with my daughter as a single mom because that is an expression of my faith. This is an expression of how much I love God. So when I educate a lot of people in the work that I do, I like people to know I wasn't playing when I was in these different communities. This was real for me. Like I lived as holy as I could during those years being a part of all of that. I was one that liked to follow rules. So if this is what we have to do and this pleases God, then I will do what I need to do. And so, I got there. I spent about 7 years in Kansas City as a part of that cult. And after a while, within that 7 year span, I don't know, it started to feel familiar to the first cult. But I didn't have enough guts to think that this was a cult too. It seemed more advanced, more organized, right? It didn't seem as I would say as just free spirited as the first cult I was a part of. And I mean, I guess I thought, well, is this big? It couldn't be a cult, you know. But I started to get dissatisfied with the lack of community. Though there were a lot of young people and they talked about community, it was a very lonely place if you lived out there and you were part of that ministry. And so a lot of subsequent ministries started to form that used to be a part of IHOP. And that's where I went wrong. I wanted more. It was almost like I was chasing the proverbial dragon. You know, they say that when you take your first hit in some hard drugs, not that I have, but this is what they say. I was still looking for that emotional religious high. And I would not get, I would lose satisfaction in a ministry often quickly. And so I started to visit other subsequent ministries, and I got invited to two of them, which ended up being cults as well. I became part of them. One was more driven there. The theme of that particular ministry was more about intercession for America and intercession for Israel. So I was in leadership at that ministry. I led the prayer line. We did all the intercession things. We, prayed for America and all the stuff like that. And I was still going to IHOP, but I was also going to this place too. This became more of my church home than IHOP did. Um, and through these 7 years, when I was out in Kansas City, I was also involved in a lot of pro-life events and prayer rallies and things of that nature. So I was really busy
Yeah.
out there, really intense, taking all this in. Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask because you were in quite a few groups. How many cults do you
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that you
yeah.
were part of in total?
Five. That's what I was getting to. That was the one. that was the third one, the one that was more intercession for America and Israel. Then the fourth one was more. It had all those themes, had end times themes, but it was I would say there was a romanticism with martyrdom. So now it's, if you really, really, really love Jesus and you really want your life to reflect that, you would be willing to lay your life down in whatever capacity is necessary. So they, and bridal mysticism, like being the bride of Christ. And they really took it to the very intensive level where claiming that if you are a Christian, that does not automatically make you the bride of Christ. You have to do a lot of suffering. So there was romanticism with suffering, martyrdom, laying things down, a lot of fasting, of fasting, denying your flesh, not being a part of everyday society, so to speak. Um, but just focus on the goal, which is I want to please Christ at the end of my life, no matter what. So I will not go to the movies. I won't go to shopping in the malls. I wouldn't do what normal people would do because I was so focused that we were chosen for this mission, for this purpose, for God, and that is the forefront. And I brought my daughter in, and she was in her teenage years at the time, but the school she went to, which was an offshoot of IHOP, they preached that there. And then she would go to these cults with me and they preached it again. And so, I really, 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 really believed a lot of this. And then the final one, but that fourth one was the one that really, I would say, cracked my chest open, for lack of a better word, or it was the one that really started to get me to think, what in the world? I have done this multiple times, right? But the fifth one was a little different because it was online and it had some of these similar themes that the fourth one had, but they were very big on intercession. We didn't have a brick and mortar church that we met at, but there would be prayer intensives all across the nation. And it would be a week long prayer intensive. They called it Joel's Army. And we would pray, all the time on the phone. We would have times where we would really be intense with this and we would take certain prayer initiatives and really go in. And then we would go to the week long prayer initiative. And it was a hybrid of conspiracy theory and all this intense Christianity. So the leader would actually put videos up of the top conspiracy theorists that you can think of on YouTube. I'll give you an example. Alex Jones. I'm pretty sure many people are familiar with him. She would play some of his videos and pull prayer initiatives from what he was saying. And then we would pray that entire week. I mean, for hours. There was at least about 400 or 500 people, men and women, and we would just pray for God's will to be done and all of this stuff. So I was deep into these things, Ryan, deep into these things. And when I left all of it, obviously I was a mess. And then realizing, what have I been in? So I was kind of like in a kind of paralyzed state for about a year after I left all of this stuff. I didn't really understand emotionally what had happened, but cognitively, I started to get some understanding. This time, I said, I can't keep doing this, right? I can't keep thinking something is good in the beginning and then it turns out to be a
Mhm.
massive cult. Like, so I said, let me take a break. Let me not go to any church right now, any ministry. If I need to still watch things online, I could, at least it's safe. And I found myself saying, well, I didn't say it this way, but I think I thought it. I don't want to spiritualize the
Mhm.
experience anymore. I need some understanding. And that's when I started reading books by Stephen Hassan on cults. I listened to his story when he was in the Moonies. Yanya Lalich, I started reading her books and hearing some stuff on YouTube, Margaret Sanger and Rick Allen Ross. And I just started consuming a lot of their material. And at first it was hard for me because I was so, everything is spiritual. Everything is spiritual. anything dealing with psychology, anything dealing with mental health, it's demonic. Whatever you need, it's all in Christ. You're laughing because you
Yeah,
know,
I'm
right?
laughing because I know. I mean, I
Yes.
all that you're saying, it's something that sadly resonates so much because I remember the founder from the cult that I was in.
Hmm.
We had no television, we had no newspapers, no internet,
Hmm.
and we'd be on a
Hmm.
compound and he would give these long speeches about how everything outside of this compound is going to shit, everything is
Yep.
evil, and
Hmm.
World War III is happening right now. But he would show us
Hmm.
like clips of what do you call them? Conspiracy theorists. And he would just give
Hmm.
like short clips, and so we're thinking, oh my God, there's a war going outside. And so we would do extra fasting. We would
Hmm.
have just nonstop prayer and we'd be so exhausted. But the fear is what
Yeah.
I think pushed us to keep going. But I wanted to go back to you real quick because
Hmm.
at what age was it that you first started to join the cults? You said it wasn't, you weren't born into it, but it was later
Hmm.
on, correct?
Yeah, I got saved at 19, and I would say probably within a year's time, um, things just happened rapidly. I got saved, I started reading, I started learning, and I started sharing. That's the type of person I am. If, somebody says, "Oh, wow, I like that perfume. What's it called?" I'm not one to hide it. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, this is the name, and you can get it from that store." Like, that's just how I am. So I started sharing quite quickly by age 19 to 20. I was already in my first cult at the age of 20, I would say. Yeah.
And what do you think? What was it about these groups that attracted you, and what was it that made you leave? Because there were five different ones. So, what was the attraction,
Mhm.
and what was the thing that made you decide to walk away for each group?
Yeah, and a lot of them, there's similarities. The need for me to belong in a community, I think, was there in all of these groups. Like-mindedness is a big one, and and that happens even in romantic relationships or friendships. I bonded quickly with a lot of the people in all of the groups. So let's say if I met you and you were part of one of those groups and we start talking and we had a lot of commonality and like-mindedness. You loved intercession, I love intercession. You knew about Alex Jones, I knew about Alex Jones. Your heart for God was like this and mine too. And I'm like, wow. So I would easily attach. I didn't have the time to discern, okay, is Ryan a safe person or not? I know you are, but hypothetically, I would skip that process for people and I would skip that process for groups. So by the time I'm already in the middle of the people, the relationships, the groups, I'm starting to see something's not right. But what I would do is, as my intuition would send up signs, I would just push it down because I learned that in my family of origin. I learned that, oh, it's just probably me. I'm just probably seeing something that's not there. I'm probably not as spiritual as Ryan is. So maybe that's why I think something's wrong with Ryan. I need to pray more. I need to fast more so I don't see it that way. So these are the things that kind of pulled me in fast and kept me in there. So I would rationalize that these places are okay. I would rationalize with myself and say, okay, this is not abuse. I wasn't even thinking abuse. I was just thinking when it got hard in these places, this was part of the suffering that I needed to do for Christ, right? The other areas was, like I said, a lot of them were filled with young adults. So that in the beginning, those first few cults, I love that. I love to see young adults because it wasn't something that you would typically see. So the community aspect, feeling like I belong, the young adults, the people that were really serious in their relationship with God is another thing that drew me in. I love that because then it didn't make it feel like I was so intense and someone else wasn't. So I connected with a lot of intense people. Intercession, as I mentioned before, was a big draw for me. Um, and another one which I have not mentioned, and this is particularly with the fourth cult, but I think I had this desire all throughout all of the cults I was in. I wanted spiritual parents. I was taught in a lot of these cults that if you have a gift and you want God to use you and you have a calling to go to the nations, to preach, to prophesy, whatever, that's great, but you won't hit your epicenter of this. You won't hit your apex. That's the word I'm looking for. You won't hit your apex of moving in your calling unless you are submitted and under some type of spiritual covering. You need spiritual parents to advise you, to guide you, to check you, to let you know if you're off, if you're living in sin or whatever. And I felt like I wanted spiritual parents so bad. This is what I was taught in a lot of the what is called NAR, New Apostolic Reformation type of churches, which has a lot to do with Christian nationalism, and that's a whole nother conversation. But they are big on you need to be submitted and under a proper covering. So I had desires for spiritual parents for that, but also because I came into these cults with certain needs that were never met in my childhood. I wanted parents that would be emotionally connecting with me. I wanted parents that would see me beyond, oh, you're too sensitive. You're just thinking deep. It's not like that. I wanted a spiritual parents that were like, you know what, Nikki, that's a great observation. It's to make me feel validated about what I observed. And so that desire continued throughout all of those cults, and I continued to look for that. And then, I was looking for a place to express the gifts that I thought God had given me. And so I couldn't imagine it being outside of the church during those times because, like with your situation you just mentioned, we were taught that outside of the church, it's evil, it's dark, you're going to go to hell if you get out there. You don't want to mess with the big bad world. So I was taught that I need to be inside, even if I have to switch houses in spiritual communities. I need to be under authority and in a church. And so, I mean, there are more things that drew me, but those are the ones that stand out for now. Yeah.
So you've spoken about trying to identify some of the gifts that you believe God may have placed within you. Did you find any of those gifts? And if so, what were those gifts that you believe that God had placed inside of your life, inside of your soul, or whatever?
Right. Right. Well, honestly enough, and this is something that I had to learn when I post cults, those gifts are still here. I still have them, but I had to learn that those gifts were not relegated just for the church. I was taught that these are the only places you can exercise those gifts. And now, especially doing the work that I've been doing with coaching and speaking and educating, I'm still functioning in my gift. But when I was in those places, like I said, I led a lot of intercession meetings, from small amount of people to big. I led them on the phone calls. I've preached, I've prophesied, I've done dream interpretation. I've done a lot of that stuff. I led, ministries with young adults, with little kids. But, when I left the last cult and I was in that initial year of what the hell just happened to me? What was my life? Looking back at the history of my life and just saying all this dysfunction, I was just, immobilized for that first year. But then when I started to kind of like, all right, Nikki, we need to deal with this. I went to get some therapy, some help because I had a lot of PT at the time, but they didn't know about cults. They didn't have anything to offer me, but I still went. And as I started to just assess my life, that's when I realized like I was too scared to operate on any gift. So I literally told God, I don't want to dream. I don't want to see. I don't want any of these gifts here. Take them. And I don't know, for like a year, I wasn't functioning, at least a year and a half. I wasn't functioning anything. I didn't feel anything. And I was actually relieved, Ryan, because I got a chance in that time to be human, to do human things, to connect with people on a human level, to see people not according to, do I see if they have sin around them? Do I detect a gossip spirit, a lust spirit? That's how I used to relate with people as far as I would look at you, but it's like, I'm scanning to see if there's any falsehood in you. And this comes from a lot of these cults. They have a very elitist type of energy. So they may not tell you that that's what they're doing, but at least the people I was running with. And in intercession that we did, we used to do something called spiritual mapping. I don't know if you ever heard of the terminology, but you go to different regions, and the intercessors would get there first, and we would start to assess what demons, what principalities were in the region. And we start to, systematically, strategically start to pray into that so that they will start to be dismantled. Like I said, I was in some serious, serious stuff. Um, but connecting with my humanity felt like such a oasis for me, like drinking water in the desert. I'm like, wait a minute, I can relate with people just for who they are. Like, I don't have to assess the sin or assess my sin, or I don't have to do all of that. I can just meet Ryan in a coffee shop and get to know Ryan for who he is. Like, it, I mean, I've always been an extrovert when I connect with people. I'm more introverted though in my personal life, but
Mhm.
I didn't have problems with me. I can talk to a stranger, but I learned talking to a stranger, you better assess them spiritually before you do anything else. That has since died. It's been almost 10 years. Next September will make 10 years since I came out of my last cult. And I love connecting with people now just for who they are, just for their stories, just like your curiosity to bring guests on and just to hear people's story. I love that now. I had a lot to unlearn. And in the beginning, I didn't understand, but over time, it was like, oh, this is good to let go. I'm throwing this in the garbage. I'm throwing this belief in the garbage. I'm throwing that perspective in the garbage. Then I'm going to take on humanity. I'm going to take on love. I'm going to take on not judging people. And I like who I am now. I'm still healing. I mean, you don't go through five cults and think you snap your fingers and you're done. But I I tell myself, Nikki, good job. You did not quit on you. You kept going until you became more of an authentic version of who you are versus who you became to exist in these cults. I had to always be on target and do all these things that I'm talking about. But now I get to be me. I get to find out who I like and what I like. And there is not that pressure to look at somebody like an object just to check off a box. Oh, did I ask you if you know Jesus yet? You need to be saved. So I can go back and say, well, I ministered to Ryan. No, I get to hang out with Ryan and find out what movies he like, what movies you like, what type of coffee you drink. I get excited about those type of things now as opposed to how I related to people in my past.
So something you said a little while back was that when you left the cults, trying to find your life again, you reconnected with your humanity. I'm now curious, during your time of going from, I guess you can say, cult hopping, during this
Yep.
period, how was your relationship with your family? Because, like you said, you had to reconnect with your humanity. So during this time that you were disconnected, was there ever a point where your family was probably saying to you, Nikki, who the hell are you? I mean, that's what my family at times were like, Ryan, who the hell are you? You're not the same guy. You're not the same happy-go-lucky guy as before. You've changed. So now I'm just
Right.
curious, what was the family dynamic for you?
Well, it's interesting because now I'm thinking of the answer. The first cult I was in, I was living in the same state that my family lived in New Jersey at the time. So they saw me go through all the things with that cult, and they saw it, walk me through being pregnant and then having my daughter, and now they have a grandchild. And so, but before that happened, my mom did not typically, my mom did not really care for the cult leader. She felt that she could just tell, like, okay, you're spending too much time over there. Everything is all about her and her perspectives. And, this is another sign sometimes that you're either in a cult or you're connecting with someone in a cultish way when everything that comes out your mouth is that, well, Pastor so and so said this, Prophet so and so said this. I learned da 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 da. And it's like, okay, where are you? in all of that? Like, what do you think? What do you say? Mostly everything that's come out your mouth is what the cult leader says. And that my mom was just like, she was happy I was saved, but she didn't like who I was becoming in that situation. To the point my mom came to the cult leader's house one time
How did that go?
to grab me and my brother and take. And I mean, like, we're adults at this point, so I'm like in my early 20s. But my mom got in her face like, "Listen, Lee," and I'm like, "Mom, don't do that. You know, you're embarrassing me." And the cult leader just was like, your mom doesn't understand the calling that's on your life. She doesn't understand what God has called you to do. So of course she would feel that way. The enemy can use even our family to try to separate us from what God has called. They always have some BS that they can spin around to make you not see something is wrong here, right? And so that was my parents kind of feeling with the first cult. But then I left Jersey and I moved to Kansas City. So the rest of my cult experience, they did not see because I didn't live in the same state. They were just happy that again, before I got saved, I was, a little out there, a little young girl out there and getting in trouble all the time. So they were just happy to see me on fire for God and raising my daughter that way. They knew I was intense. They loved the passion and the fire. I went from before I got saved, I was very timid to some degree. I didn't like to speak in front of people. I didn't really like to read past what was required. I had my music on. Music was my love at the time. But then once I got saved and I started researching and reading, I was like changing in front of everybody's eyes, like, whoa, and so then we would get together on the holidays and who's going to pray? Then I would pray. My mother would call me and say, okay, I have this list of people that need to be prayed. Can I send you this list? Can you intercede? And so they did not see what I went through. And even after I left the last cult, I wound up moving with them for like 8 months after I left Kansas City because it was like, all right, at least I know the dysfunction in the family. It's better than what I've been dealing with out here. And I tried to explain it to my mom and to my parents, like spiritual abuse and what I didn't have all the language I have now as a coach, but it was enough to let her know something, was horrible happened to not only myself, my daughter. Remember, she's a teenager at this time. So she's ingesting this just as much. So as I started to be deprogrammed, I tried to help and assist her at her pace to also deprogram because she believed it just like I did. And Leah Remini's show on Scientology that was out years ago, around that time, it was water for me and my daughter. Like, it just really helped us to see, though it wasn't Scientology, that we were in some deep stuff. And this was very similar to what cult survivors in Scientology had experienced. Some similarities, a lot of similarities. So they didn't really see the rest of that journey. Yeah.
So then your journey of, leaving the cults and connecting with yourself, getting to know yourself better, how did that lead you to now becoming an educator on cult recovery?
Well, Ryan, to tell you the truth, this was not on my bingo card. Was not on my life bingo card at all. My mentality has always been, okay, let me work through recovery healing for myself. Let me put my own oxygen mask on, turn and put my oxygen mask on my daughter and help her. And let me continue to come out of some of these generational cycles that I started to realize as I started to heal. Because, and for many, this is not everybody, but for many, if you start pulling on that cult recovery thread, oftentimes a lot of survivors have a connection between, religious trauma, spiritual trauma, and developmental trauma in their family of origin. They're almost interconnected. And the easier part was acknowledging that I was in a cult and acknowledging that I was a part of these different ministries and starting to see, okay, this happened. This is what was done to me. The harder part was having the courage to see the connection between my family of origin, the woundings and the trauma, and how that kind of um, enhanced my journey to be a part of different cults. And then the harder part after that was turning inward. I did not ask for any of this. It was an injustice. It was wrong. But for me, in order to really start to recover, I had to sit with Nikki and say, okay, what did Nikki have in her backpack when she started to go to all these different cults? And I kind of said some of it already. I wanted to belong. I wanted spiritual parents. I wanted the love. I wanted, being able to do things for God. And a lot of these needs are not wrong, but I was looking for them outside of myself instead of looking within. And for those who are still spiritually connected within and above. So I miss that, and there's a scripture that talks about loving your neighbor and and as you love yourself. And I was focused on loving my neighbor and doing all the things, the works of the church, and then focus on loving God. But I missed the middle part, which was loving me. And so I didn't have boundaries. I didn't, it was just a whole lot of stuff. So the third part of the deeper recovery is being able to see what I came to these ministries with, the longings, the desires that might have been healthy, but they were not going to meet them. But I wanted them to be met. And so, even now to this day, I try to make, okay, Nikki, what are we feeling? What's in the body? You know, my temperature, is it all turned up to level 10 for friendship right now? And it's good to know these things, because then if I said, ooh, my level's really high, if I go out and I meet people, I can still meet people, but be aware that my level is at 10. Because when it's really high, a lot of times we will grab whatever's in front of us just to say, I have a friend, or I have a romantic partner, or I have a church community now. Instead of slowing down, taking things at a slow pace, assess, the person, let time pass before just grabbing the first thing. But when your need is really high, that typically happens. So if I know I'm at a level 3, I still do the same things, but I have more of that confidence within versus I have to grab what's in front of me. So, assessing internally where I'm at, I still do that to this day with different attachments, with different opportunities, with different people, places, and things. The answer does not need to be yes for everything and everyone. There has to be that balance. And that's something that I did not have in those cult experiences.
And I love that because earlier in the very beginning, you were talking about how you were brought up to pretty much just obey authority, just do what you were told. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's a great way to prepare someone to enter into a bunch of cult realms, cult worlds. But now I hear you really taking your power back and making your own decisions,
Mm-hmm.
but also having the time and the judgment to take a pause and have assessment before making decisions. So now I wanted to get into a different part of your life, which I find to be very fascinating, and that is your relationship with the community. Because now you are using your skills, you're using your gifts, if I can say, to help
Mm-hmm.
others in their recovery. Can you talk a bit about that? How important it is for you to share this gift of recovery to the community?
Okay. And I just realized I didn't fully answer your question, but I'm going to tie it into this question you just put in front of me. Like I said before, I was just focusing on my recovery and my daughters, and I had no desire to do any of the work I'm doing now. 2020, fast forward to 2020, pandemic starts. I have some health complications that had nothing to do with COVID, had surgery, everything went fine. During that 6 to 7 week window of recuperating, um, I'll say this, all of a sudden, I had desires to actually do something and touch humanity. I was not even planning on doing this. I was going to do something for my community. Um, I had a website, a name, I grabbed the domain. I've always felt like there were times where God or my creator wanted me to do something like what I'm doing now. I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I always said no. Now, yes, I was doing the intercession and stuff like that in the church. I'm not talking about that. I said no more than I said yes as far as participating because there was this thing in the back of my mind where it was like, I'm not ready. I still have all these things I need to work on. I need to fast more. I need to pray more. So my answer was usually no. For some strange reason, the end of 2020, I just started to have all these ideas of, okay, I'm going to get a website. I'm going to start sharing some of the things that I've learned, but I was not going to touch this topic. It was something totally different, but it was still going to be for the community. Well, I got invited to Clubhouse in 2020, which was social audio app. And I started going into rooms where they were talking about narcissism, narcissistic family systems. They were talking about spiritual abuse. And so I decided to create a club called Spiritual Abuse and Cults that I ran for like 2 years on Clubhouse. And we would talk about these things. And I started seeing people come in the rooms. And, the way I designed it was listen, you can be an atheist and come in this room. You can be a pastor and come in this room. You can be someone that's in spiritual. It doesn't matter where you are now. If you've been through this in some way, shape, or form, come in. Let's resource together. Let's support each other. Let's encourage each other. And that's what I did. But I found that there was a lot of people in the Black community that were coming up and sharing and saying, I've not told anybody this. This happened 10 years ago. This happened 5 years ago. Oh my gosh, you're sharing my story. I didn't even know this was such a thing. I didn't even know I've been through religious abuse. This is why the light bulb started coming on and they were wanting more. Nikki, where can I go to find therapists that talk about this? Where can I go to? And I was like, I don't know. I was like, I would point them to other resources that weren't particularly Black, but I didn't find any. So a colleague, friend of mine who, started to come to my rooms and we met that way too. And we were like, where are the resources for the Black community? And so in that and a lot of heart discussions, we started something called Surviving the Black Church podcast. We've done one season. Season two will be out in January of next year. And we started to just talk about religious abuse, religious trauma, in churches and a little bit in cult dynamics as well too. And in that process, the listeners started coming back and saying, well, hey, this is great information. You're actually helping me to acknowledge what I've been through, but now what do I do now? And so we started a support group, and it's under our organization called Black Religious Trauma Recovery Network. And so under that umbrella, we are doing things to resource the Black community for those who have experienced religious abuse, cult abuse, things of that nature. And we do support groups twice a month, every second and fourth Thursday of the month, and it's free. And people can come. We have different themed topics, and we talk about this. And the need is so great. Every time we just had a support group this past Thursday, and every time we have them, they're so thankful and appreciative and said, please don't stop doing this. We need this. Because a lot of them found that if they got to the point in their journey where they were able to acknowledge, this is what I've experienced, they would look for resources and just say, well, there are really hardly anything for us, but I still need the help. So I'm just going to jump in wherever I can. But because of the cultural differences, a lot of their experiences are not witnessed and validated and supported and affirmed, and so they just kept that part reserved for themselves. But now, in these groups and more offerings we will have under that network, survivors can feel like they are seen and they are heard. Even their cultural experiences of and some of our experiences are very similar to those in Hispanic dynamics that have experienced that too. The church mom, the church prophet, the deliverance minister, and just certain euphemisms that are shared in these type of experiences. So there's a lot to unpack. But the bigger thing is the Black communities. our history with this country and how we were brought over to this country and we were enslaved, and a lot of our spiritual practices were stripped from us and we were forced to take on Christianity. Now, we made lemonade out of the lemons that were given us, but because of that historic foundation of how we came into Christianity collectively, it is even much harder for us to recover individually and collectively. Like a lot of Black people, how they learned how to read was through the Bible, how they learned how to come together. The Bible and Christianity was always in the epicenter. A lot of today's rappers and singers and musicians and actors, they all got their start in the Black church. So when a Black person says, I have been abused and wounded in a Black church experience, it's hard to find resources and it's hard to be believed because we are we are probably more of a religious people statistically, and this comes from Pew Research Center. Black people are the most religious in this country, and 8 out of 10 identify and affiliate with Christianity. So we are very religious. But because of that, it's even harder when we've been wounded and abused. Our community does not really have space or welcomes recovery in the church because the church is what harmed us. So, yeah.
So you never saw yourself having this role, but then you go to, was it Clubhouse? Is that the name of the app before?
Clubhouse, Clubhouse.
You
Uh huh.
you got on Clubhouse, and then you start seeing the need for people to have not only connection but also information and resources. And I see that you have a website up and you have a book. Can you, or an ebook? Can you talk a little bit about that and summarize for us what it's all about?
Okay. I just released this on election day. Ironic, it wasn't intended, but that's what happened. And it's called Understanding Christian Nationalism and its Impact on Religious Trauma Survivors. A lot of people, over the past, I would say 10 years, it's been very rocky politically. And this is not a matter of being a Democrat or a Republican. For survivors who have experienced religious abuse and are dealing with religious trauma, many of them have been exacerbated. The trauma has been exacerbated for them during these political seasons, especially the ones we're just coming out of and the changing of a new president, President Trump. And so many people have been triggered, and what could potentially happen in the future is very triggering. It's one thing when you heard my story and say, okay, Ryan, I was in these cults and I'm out. I'm out. I have choice now. I get to choose where I want to go. I get to choose what I see. It's another thing when what you came out of looks like what could be politically taking place in your region, in your nation. And so there are so many similarities of what it felt like to be under a religious abuse leader, as far as the way they lead, the way they speak. And so many survivors are triggered in this time and really are looking for solace, for safety, for validation that this is what they're experiencing. And so I wrote this ebook to encourage survivors to say, you're not crazy when you turn on the news and your heart rate starts to rise up. You're not crazy if your dream life has started to be invaded with the fears of what could be. You're not crazy if you're having, a lot of strained relationships with family and friends, not necessarily on who did you vote for or who you align yourself with, but where things could potentially be heading. It is going to be very hard for religious trauma survivors. So my first form of resource was this ebook to get it into the hands of people that say, I don't know who to talk about this. I don't know how to articulate this to my husband, to my coworkers, what I feel because of what I've experienced. So if that's where you are, this ebook is for you. It's for a small fee. to support the work that I'm doing, but you will find things in there that help explain where you are right now and some tips on how to move forward as politically things start to change here in this nation. I will be offering more support for survivors in this area. I just recently started talking about this part of my cult experience, which was being connected to a lot of organizations, prayer rallies. Like I said, I was very deep into the pro-life movement, very deep into, like I said, conspiracy theories and praying all these things. And now I see these things outside of a toxic religious perspective. I can see, as a trauma coach, trauma recovery coach, I can see how traumatic a lot of this can be for people. So the ebook is the first phase of support for survivors who find themselves in that place right now. And I will unveil more that I will be offering in that regard. So if you're like, hey, Nikki, I wonder what the more is, sign up on my website to receive updates, and you'll be included when I release the more for those who want to know more about
And
Christian
what's the website?
nationalism.
What is the website?
NikkiGspeaks.com. And if you go to my website, you will find all my social handles: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and you'll find the ebook there. You'll find, if you say, hey, Nikki, I like what you're sharing. I need support. I need help. I would like to understand more about your coaching services. Look at my calendar. You'll find the area where you can do a discovery call with me, and we can talk and find out if we are a good fit for each other. But I do support survivors through support groups, one-on-one coaching, courses, podcasts, things of that nature. So, if you would like to work more with me one on one, you can check that out on my website as well.
And now is the time where I ask every guest the same question. I hope you're ready.
I hope so.
So, my question is, Nikki, what is your truth that heals?
Well, I thought about this and I was going to say something different. I was like, no, I'm going to say what I always say because it's been medicine for me. That doesn't mean it's medicine for someone else, but it may be. And I talked about a lot of the hardships that I experienced in the cult life, but believe it or not, I'm a very optimistic person and I'm a fighter. After being a part of 5 cults, I just did not want to lay down and die and just say this marks the rest of my life. Really, like I only lived chapters 1 through 5. And so my truth that heals is that it is possible, if your chapters 1 through 5 have been horrendous, horrific, filled with abuse, toxic relationships. It doesn't even have to be religious abuse or religious trauma. It can be with anything, but it doesn't look good those first 5 chapters. The truth is, once you become aware and you start to pull away from these toxic situations, the pen that writes the next 5 to 10 chapters and more, it's in your hand. See, when I was connected to a lot of these cults, the cult leader, the narcissistic boss, the narcissistic friend, I was very disempowered. I did not understand my own personal power. But after I left all of that and I started to work with therapists and I started to do my own homework and started to heal, and then I started to get some training so that I could be a trauma recovery coach, and I started sharing my story, I started to say, wait a minute, the cult leader for the 4th cult, he doesn't control my life now. The cult leader for the 2nd cult, they don't control my life now. I get to write my story. So it may sound corny, but the empowering part is the pen is in my hand now. It's no longer in their hands. I allowed them to write chapters 1 through 5 because I was unaware. But now that I know, I get to write the story. And my chapters 5 through 10 does not have to look like chapters 1 through 5. It can be filled with stories of me exploring this earth, this world. I get to find out what I like, what movies I like, what type of people I like to hang out with, what makes me laugh, what makes me cry. I get to find out who I am internally. I get to find out who people are in this world and this planet. There's a whole lot more of life that you get to live, and your identity until you take your last breath does not have to be a trauma identity. I can stand before people now and share my story and laugh and make jokes because it is something I experienced. It's in chapter 1 through 5, but it's not the fullness of my story. And it does not speak to who I am as a person. So the truth that heals is you can be empowered to take that pen back and write your life story the way that you desire it to be written and not based off of the traumas you've been through, the abuses you've been through. You are. It's what happened to you, it's what you've been through. But who are you for chapters 5 through 10 and more? And if that's something where you say, Nikki, I don't know who I am, that's the beauty of it. Recovering from trauma is not all letting go of everything, it's also who do I become now? What do I grab a hold of now? So if you don't know who you are or who you want to become, this is where the pen comes in handy. Start journaling, start getting out in nature, start drawing, start singing for some of you until you start connecting with who you really are and the inside. And if I could go through 5 quotes and talk to you like this from a real place, I think many of you and your stories, you can do the same thing. And this is called resilience. This is called bouncing back. This is called I'm not allowing what I've been through to stamp my life. It's what I've been through. It's not who I am. So I encourage you to find out who you are and show up in the world as that person, not what you've been through. And that's my truth.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for sharing your truth. And it's been an honor having you here on the Truth That Heals podcast.
Thank you, Ryan.